It began as a routine mid-morning departure from Paris Charles de Gaulle, Hexagone Airways Flight HX394, an Airbus A321neo bound for Lisbon. Gate L51 smelled of coffee and jet fuel, the kind of nervous perfume airports wear without thinking. Families in sandals, a pair of consultants comparing slide decks, an elderly couple trading a paperback back and forth to keep their hands busy. On the flight strip, the aircraft, registration F-HXQA, caught the sun on her sharklets and the gloss of her new paint. Nothing about her looked like a secret. At 10:19, Captain Lemaire read the clearance, the French lilt smoothing out the clipped ICAO phrases. Hexagone 394, cleared to Lisbon, runway 26 right via Okipa 7 Alpha. He signed the takeoff numbers with a felt pen, the old habit that made the new jet feel like an old friend. The FO, a calm woman named Berenice Ancel, ran the FMS check, poked the perf page, cross-checked the SID, switched the transponder to TARI. Cabin crew reported green. Doors armed, galleys secure, 162 souls on board. Pushback, tow bar unclipped. Taxi past the snaking queue of metal lining 26 right like a patient parade. The morning convective build-up was nothing dramatic, a halo of fair-weather cumulus, a September light that turned aluminum into rivers. Rotate at 10:34. Paris slid away. The aircraft climbed like poetry written by engineers. 40 minutes later, the radar screen in the Paris en route center hiccuped, just a blink, the way a tired eye misreads a word. Controller Augustin Lebrun, a man who tracked metal for a living and jazz by night, glanced up to catch the track label HX394 Ghost for half a second, then settle. He made a tiny note in pencil, not because it mattered, but because that's what you do when something twitches in a system that does not twitch. Above the massive central, a few knots of turbulence ruffled the service. Coffee lids darted. A child laughed at the way his straw jumped. The seatbelt sign chimed on, then off. People went back to being people, playlists, Sudoku, the measured pilgrimage of the aisle to the lavatory. At 11:22, an automated ACARS message pinged maintenance in Roissy, a low-level caution on a cabin environmental sensor. Harmless, a nuisance. The sort of message that gets filed and forgotten, like a hiccup in the belly of a healthy thing. A minute later, a second ping. Smoke detect FWD cargo, not confirmed. The captain looked at the ECAM, eyes narrowing. The cargo smoke system was notorious for false positives after certain cleaning fluids. They ran the checklist. No odor in the cabin, no enunciation persisted. The airplane was steady, a thin white line on a blue page nobody was reading. At 11:29, HX394 disappeared. On Lebrun's scope, the track label blinked to CST, coast, no secondary surveillance, and then went to silence. ADS-B plots on an adjacent display froze like birds mid-flight. Voice contact did not respond. The controller raised his eyebrows first, the smallest rebellion against panic, and then he reached for the microphone. Hexagone 394, Paris control, radio check. The frequency quieted in that way it does when every pilot along 200 miles of airway stops breathing to listen. Nothing, he tried again. Hexagone 394, Paris control, ident if you read. The code remained what it wasn't, not there. Procedures are dull, and that is their genius. Lebrun called the supervisor. Supervisor called the duty manager. A colleague dialed the airline's operations center, where a tracker on a big screen already rippled a red banner. Loss of signal HX394. The airport authority alerted the gendarmerie. The gendarmerie called the BEA, the Bureau d'Enquête et d'Analyse, whose on-call investigator blinked twice at the neon of the pager, then said, "Je pars," and didn't finish his espresso. By noon, the rumor had spread without words. In the terminal, a cluster of families waiting for HX394's round-trip cousins felt it before they heard it. Something about the way staff looked through them, the way announcements didn't mention anything they should have. A woman with anxious hands, Marina Sampaio, whose husband was in seat 22C, texted and saw the text not turn blue. She texted again, an offering to whatever gods route messages through clouds. At 12:17, a tug driver on the south ramp radios in a voice he cannot make gentle. "Ops, you're going to think I'm mad. But Tower just asked, is there a Hexagone jet on approach to 26 right that no one cleared?" The tower had seen it, a clean white nose rolling out of a high cloud like a thought. They hadn't called it. No transponder code squawked, no voice announced an arrival, yet here it was, a surgeon's steady hand flying an immaculate ILS. Carbuncle rumor sprouted immediately. Hijack. Ghost. Military exercise. The airfield went to heightened posture, fire services staged discreetly, a follow-me car idling. The runway stayed nominal, no reason to close it, every reason to keep eyes on. The A321 crossed the threshold at 12:23 with the stately grace of Cat 3 Autoland. Flare, spoilers, reverses. The nose wheel kissed the stripes. The airplane slowed, tracked centerline, and then, instead of vacating onto the high speed like a good citizen, rolled out to a walking pace and simply stopped. The tower cleared other traffic with the kind of careful urgency that says, "This is not normal, but we are professionals. We will not let normal burn." The follow-me eased forward. The jet did not taxi. It did not respond to light signals. It did not strobe, because the strobe selector had been set to off by a pilot who was not present. On the standby VHF, there was nothing, not breath, not rustle, not cough. The fire chief, Capitaine Delorme, a practical man with a philosopher's eyes, approached up the left side as trained. He looked at the cockpit windows, black as a pianist's tuxedo. He saw nobody. He made the universal gesture to someone who wasn't there, fingers together, mouth like a fish. "Are you okay?" The airplane was mute. They laddered to L1. The door was disarmed. The handle gave easily, like it had been waiting. The cabin was a still life, safety cards half read, a scarf in 18A draped like a memory, a plastic fork nudging an untouched quiche. Every overhead bin latched, every seat back upright. No people, not a single person, just a thin thread of cabin air singing through an invisible seam, the voice of a place that had forgotten its purpose. In the flight deck, both seats were empty. The autopilot had been disengaged by weight on wheels, and logic, a polite bow. The park brake was set by nobody. The transponder, left in standby, could not explain how it had flown an approach you need to tell the airplane to fly. The EFBs were dark. A neat printed flight plan lay under a paperclip, the way you leave a note for your future self when you plan to be back in 5 minutes. The airport closed the runway then because faith comes second to evidence. The airplane was towed to a remote stand hemmed by gendarmes. The sleeves over the windows, opaque tarps, appeared like eyelids. Somewhere, someone whispered a prayer. Somewhere else, someone in operations whispered a number. 162. They would count the seats again, like counting beads, as if miscounting could conjure human beings from air. By 12:40, Lebrun stood at the glass of the ops room and watched the aircraft he'd lost and found be wrapped in blue lights and procedure. He put down his pencil and realized his hand was shaking. No one had seen anything like it. In aviation, novelty is not your friend. From the moment boarding started, the story of HX394 existed in 100 private versions, all truthful, all incomplete. The narratives overlapped like contrails, sometimes parallel, sometimes crossing and dissipating, never quite making the picture. Investigators live for this, the mosaic built from shards. Seat 14F belonged to a Spanish art teacher named Diego Alvarez, whose habit was to take a photo of the wing every time he flew. He posted it to friends with the caption, "The wing always knows the way." At 10:38, climb thrust set, Paris shrinking into a puzzle, Diego captured the silver plank carving through cloud, a small reflection of his own face in the double-glazed window. He added a sticker, a tiny lemon, to commemorate the lemon tart he had impulsively bought at the pull near the gate. He didn't know he was documenting the last ordinary minutes. Row 3 had a businessman, Martin Joubert, a man who wore his schedule like a uniform. He judged flights by whether he could finish a deck before the beverage cart. Row 22 had Marina's husband, Rafael Sampaio, a luthier from Lisbon, who smelled faintly of cedar, the perfume of wood that stays in the fingers. Row 32 had a stag party too tired to be loud. In the rear galley, flight attendant Elodie clipped a bag of rubbish and joked that Lisbon would be sun with a side of pastéis. It made the galley laugh. At 11:21, the seatbelt sign chimed on. Minor bumps. The A321 shrugged the air. People shrugged back. The captain's voice came a moment later, warm and unhurried. Mesdames, Messieurs, good morning from the flight deck. We have some light turbulence for a short period. Nothing to worry about. We'll keep the sign on for a few minutes. Thank you for your cooperation. Diego, who liked pilots who sounded like geography teachers, felt reassured. What happened afterwards, if you lined up the passengers' recollections, had the rhythm of a dream that repeats a detail until it becomes the whole world. Multiple people noticed a smell. Not smoke exactly, not fire. Something like heated plastic, faint and gone. Elodie did a sweep down the aisle, touched the backs of seats with the practiced palm of someone who calibrates comfort. Vous allez bien? She asked a nervous flyer, and the nervous flyer, touched by attention, said, yes, actually, they would be fine. In the forward galley, the oven light tested itself like a shy child. A minute or two later, the cabin lighting drifted from the daylight setting to a slightly cooler wash, a hue that wasn't wrong, but wasn't the default. The interphone buzzed. Elodie picked up, nodded, her eyes doing the silent dance of copy that. She and a colleague knelt at the carpet, lifted a discreet hatch, peered at a panel nobody knows exists unless they work there. Passengers forget that airplanes have ground truth hidden under carpets and behind panels. They look like furniture until suddenly they look like a system. The next moment that stamped itself into memory came from the PA, not the captain this time. A female voice calm enough to add to the strange. Cabin crew, prepare for an immediate operations check, not standard words. The more frequent flyers frowned at each other with the fraternity of the initiated. Diego, who was neither frightened nor blasé, filmed a few seconds on his phone. The aisle stretching ahead, Elodie walking with intent, a toddler chewing on a plastic giraffe. He did not know he was capturing the baseline against which everything else would be measured. Marina's husband texted one more time. Over Spain, all good, see you at 4. And then the message clock stopped. No WhatsApp ticks, no delivered. When the captain's voice came again, it was the same temperature and yet a little nearer. Ladies and gentlemen, for operational reasons, we will be making a short stop before continuing to Lisbon. Please remain seated. We will update you shortly. A short stop? In the sky, there are no short stops. You are either flying or you are not. People did what people do when reality pulls a thread. Some invented certainty. It's a medical. Others invented drama, bomb threat. A gentleman in 6C insisted to his neighbor that he had once diverted to Lyon for a pigeon strike. The cabin became a community of speculation, governed by the iron law of politeness at 36,000 feet. We will handle this with jokes, until we can't. And then the world got quiet in a way airplanes rarely do. The whine of the fans eased. The press of the air changed, subtle, like ears adjusting before they need to. The descent was shallow at first, and then purposeful. Flaps moved with their usual sigh. The geography below grew detail. Diego filmed again, this time the earth, a ribbon of road through pine, a rectangular scar of tarmac, not big enough for an A321. He raised his eyebrows at his own camera, like surely not here. The woman in 10A made the sign of the cross without irony. The landing itself, according to every single person who later remembered it, was gentle. Too gentle for a scare, too precise for an improvisation. They touched down on a strip of asphalt that came out of nowhere. No terminal, no jetways, no painted logos coaxing you to a city. The rollout was brief, the engines idled, the cabin stayed lit in its cool wash. A door somewhere clicked in the fuselage, mechanical, deliberate. The announcement that followed was not from the captain. It was a male voice without the captain's little rugby club humor. It spoke French first, then English. "For your safety, we will deplane here. Please leave your belongings. Follow crew instructions. Do not use your phones." It was not a request. The phrasing had the bland authority of a form letter. A passenger once called that tone medical, as if the plane had turned into a hospital and the nurses were in charge. They opened a door to steps that had materialized as if a magician had hissed a word. Outside, 3 vehicles with beacons, no airline logos, no airport insignia. People in high-vis, some with patches that looked official from a distance and undecipherable up close. They counted groups of 10, moved them in files like schoolchildren who have been promised a surprise. The crew did their crew magic. Smiles, hands out flat, the choreography of calm. A woman cried and then stopped when Elodie squeezed her shoulder and said, "C'est bon, madame," because the way Elodie said it made it true for 10 seconds at a time. Phones stayed mostly in pockets because the social contract is stronger than we think. When someone says don't and they are wearing a vest and a radio set, many people comply. A few filmed anyway. One captured a sign by the chain link, a faded French word for no trespassing with bullet holes. Another filmed the pine trees beyond like they were a green curtain drawn around a stage. They were ushered into buses with tinted windows. No logos, air conditioning humming a frequency that masked thought. Someone tried to ask, "Where are we?" and got, "Just a few minutes, please." In the bus, the man with the medical tone introduced himself as logistics. They would be taken to a facility for processing. Processing is a word that eats its own tail. People exchanged looks across the aisle that said, "Is this normal? And I will wait to panic until you panic." Diego texted Marina, "We landed but not Lisbon, we'll explain," and watched the message sit, unblessed by network. The bus moved into a forest that could have been any forest. No towers, no terminal, just a road drawn with a ruler and then forgotten. Nobody on HX394 saw the airplane take off again. Most did not know it had, not until later, when the news learned a new phrase. It came back alone. By early afternoon, the story had 2 incompatible halves, an airplane that had never left and 162 people who had. The airport lived at the join, trying to hold the halves together without letting either fall. In a grey office that smelled of printer toner and rain, the BEA set up a forward cell. The lead investigator, Claire Moreau, arrived with a canvas satchel and a face that knew how to hide surprise. She had worked metal in meadows and metal in oceans. She preferred, professionally, that airplanes not surprise her. Claire began where all investigations begin. Time. She wrote it on the whiteboard in black marker so thick it looked like a certainty. 10:34, takeoff. 11:22, ACARS nuisance. 11:29, loss of SSR ADS-B. 12:23, landing CDG. 12:40, aircraft secured. 12:57, first call from a supposed passenger relative reporting a text that mentioned stop before Lisbon. These were stones in a river. She would try to walk across. Paris ACC provided replays. On the radar, the primary skin paint of HX394 survived a few sweeps after the secondary code died, like a heartbeat disconnected from a voice. Then, even that faded. The Mode S poles, those little electronic nods airplanes trade with ground stations, ceased as if someone had turned off a switch that was supposed to be out of reach. The VHF tape had nothing, nobody stepping on anyone, Nobody shouting or sighing hungrily at a blocked frequency. Silence is evidence too, but it does not volunteer its meaning. CDG Tower had footage of the final approach, at least a high-quality capture from a runway cam that loved symmetry. Claire watched the A321 follow the ILS down like a violin follows a metronome. Landing lights on, gear down, flaps full, the pitch in the flare perfect. It looked, you had to say it, like a textbook Autoland. But Autolands are not conjured by aircraft out of moral excellence. Somebody arms them, sets them, checks the minima, assures that the redundancy is ready. The FCOM does not include a chapter on how to Autoland by telepathy. In the Ghost's flight deck, the DVR would tell a story if it lived. Claire signed the chain of custody form for the CVR and FDR removal. The gendarmes already had them, warm still, a small metal heart in evidence bags. She eyed the CVR, knowing what everyone knew, 2 hours of audio at most. If the airplane had been quiet after the diversion, if it had flown hands-free, voice-free, what would the tape hold? Fans, chimes, the lonely purr of a machine. She had fallen in love with CVRs years ago because they turned air into memory. She also knew their cruelty. They recorded over themselves without grief. Back in operations, Lebrun and the supervisor traced the breadcrumbs the airplane had left in the sky, invisibly, the en route ADS-C contract, the one done via satellite that sometimes keeps talking when the transponder sulks. A technician, a brilliant sleep-deprived man named Karim, wrangled logins nobody understands and fetched an arcane dump. There it was. Periodic position reports sent to a third-party network under a service called Safe Return, a product name Claire had not seen on any operator's declared systems list. The coordinates drew a line that veered off the published airway, softened into a hold over a rectangle of forest nobody had labeled, then made us straight into a runway that official France did not admit existed. "Whose runway?" Claire asked, and a gendarme scratched his chin in a way that meant both "we will find out" and "we already suspect." ACARS showed its own interior monologue, a burst of "Oops" check messages to the cabin controller unit, a door CTR armed status confirming something about a logic test, a cryptic VESTA protocol armed, ready. VESTA meant nothing to Claire until an engineer from the airline, a quiet woman named Nadia Ferrell, exhaled through her nose and said, "That's not ours. That's someone's add-on." "Someone," Claire said, writing the word SAFERETURN on the board, spacing the letters as if that could pull meaning into the room. "Vendor," Nadia said finally. "A safety overlay, pilot incapacitation recovery. We trialed it in a sandbox. It shouldn't be live. Yet your airplane just used it to land," Claire said. And Nadia's small nod was a surrender to gravity. The timeline thickened. At 11:21, the first cargo smoke false positive hit. At 11:23, the service logic associated that with an environmental sensor's nuisance alarm. At 11:25, a Datalink message, origin uncertain, requested an operations check. At 11:26, the cabin bus acknowledged. At 11:27, the airplane initiated a route modification toward a preloaded safe field with a runway long enough to love an A321. At 11:29, transponder logic apparently entered a mode, the file called MCON, emissions control, the sort of thing you build into drones and never admit exists in passenger metal. The SSR drop wasn't a failure. It was a choice the airplane made because a human or software asked it to. Paris ACC cross-checked military NOTAMs, nothing obvious. The gendarmes made calls with calm voices that implied urgency by refusing to show it. The airline's CEO arrived with a team of PR and a tie that was 1 inch too cheerful for the room. He said the right things about safety and cooperation and the comfort of the families. Then he asked very gently if they could avoid using the word autonomous. Claire did what Claire does when the ground goes soft. She looked for people. ATC, crew rosters, maintenance logs, the cabin crew names, Elodie among them. everyone who would know which details their disciplines forgot to teach their databases. She interviewed LeBron, who repeated as if mantra could hypnotize sense from nonsense. It flew a perfect ILS. Nobody was there. She listened to his voice for the quiver people call fear. What she heard was bewildered professionalism, which is a species of grief. Then came the calls from the edge of the map. A volunteer fire brigade captain from a commune in Sologne rang the BEA switchboard, left a message that the receptionist transcribed without punctuation. "I am not saying anything official, but a big airplane landed near the old strip by the forest, and there were people with armbands and buses, and then it left again, and we thought maybe an exercise." A farmer texted a local journalist a blurry photo of a white tail against a tree line and a caption, "Too big for our sky." A paramedic friend of the farmer wrote, "We had to sign papers. We transported people. They were fine mostly. They looked confused." Claire drove a pen dot onto a map where the calls clustered and drew a circle. Then she drew a line from that circle back to Paris. "It came home," she said, so softly that only Nadia heard. It came home without them. At 1510, the FDR metadata yielded its first gift, a flag showing Autoland true, commanded with the right preconditions, flaps, auto brake, the dance steps all followed. Another flag, stranger, remote authorized, false. If the aircraft believed remote authorization was false, how had it done anything remotely commanded? The engineer in Claire wanted to diagram until the page ran out. The human in her wanted to call Elodie and ask if her voice was as calm in person as it sounded in every passenger's memory. News crews gathered at the fence, lenses like porcupine spines. Social media frayed and knotted at once. Ghost jet trended. A conspiracy YouTuber posited time slip. A serious pilot forum opened a thread titled CDG Mystery A321 Facts Only, and then filled it with speculation. The airline issued a statement that said nothing and everything. "We are cooperating fully with authorities. Safety is our absolute priority." As dusk thought about happening, a pattern emerged in the data. A logic that felt like a code phrase in a language none of them had signed up to speak. VESTA, safe field, MCON, OPS check. Somewhere between the cargo smoke false positive and the buses with their tinted windows, a decision tree had been climbed, one branch at a time, by a machine that had been taught to save lives. It had saved them in its own way, perhaps. It had also erased itself from the sky, then returned like a dog that remembers the way home, but not the people it ran with. Claire capped her marker. "Night falls," she said, an old habit, narrating the day so it didn't eat her. "Tomorrow, find the runway, find the buses, find the voice on the PA." She looked at the CVR on the table as if it might answer, as if it could, for once, have found room on its tape for the silence that had defined an afternoon. The runway was not on any tourist map, but the locals knew it the way you know a scar. You learn to stop touching it, and then, on certain days, you touch it again, just to remember. Old men in Sologne called it La Piste des Pins, the Pine Runway, where the Armée de l'Air once practiced dispersal in the Cold War, or so the myth went. You could ride a bicycle there at dusk if you promised the trees you wouldn't tell. Wild thyme grew between the cracks. A faded 22 still clung to the end, like chalk after rain. At 11:47 on 14th of September 2021, the pines whispered to each other, and then all at once fell quiet. A white nose appeared above the dark ribbon, tall as a church door. The jet did not announce itself. It slipped into place as if it had always lived there in the understory of the forest, a thing made of sky trying on the earth. It crossed the threshold with confidence and kissed the asphalt with main gear that glowed briefly like eyes opening. The reversers sobbed, the air tulled around them. And then stillness, the second stillness of a day that would be built from stillnesses. Fire Captain Guy Lafitte was mending a gate on his cousin's property when the air changed pressure. He looked up in time to see the tail slice the line of trees, the sharklet gleam, the aircraft's logo he didn't recognize. Hexagone Airways, neat, modern, polite. He put down his hammer and said nothing because there was no one to say it to. A moment later, his pager did not go off, which somehow scared him more than if it had. He called the volunteer brigade chief, who said conversationally that today was exercise day at the Departmental Logistics Center, so if he saw any odd movements, they were likely rehearsals. Guy had been in the business long enough to know that rehearsals usually involve tea urns and fluorescent armbands, not A321s. The strip had been trimmed for weeks. Someone had loved it into readiness. Cones had been tucked into the grass like eggs. The military gate at the old perimeter was oiled. As the A321 slowed, 2 Land Rovers eased from behind a berm, followed by a pair of coaches painted the color of understatement and a van with a shield logo nobody recognized, sub-prefectural maybe, or civil safety with a facelift. A man with an armband that said SIDPC stepped into his best posture and became official. He waved a wand that wasn't a wand. It was a baton made of authority. Passengers peered out at trees instead of terminals. The cabin doors opened with the velvety sigh of a thing that has practiced. Elodie led the first 10 down steps that had been magicked to the fuselage by a set of hands wearing gloves. The air smelled like resin and wet stone. Grasshoppers took one look at the procession and decided to be elsewhere. "What airport is this?" someone asked in English, and a man in a vest replied, not unkindly, "Temporary field, temporary field." The phrase folded itself into Diego's brain and sat there, knees tucked to chest. He watched the line of passengers walk past faded signs, Propriété de l'État, Défense d'entrée, and into the double doors of a modular building that looked like it had been ordered from a catalogue titled Contingency. Inside, the lights were bright and consistent, the furniture stackable, the posters bilingual and vaguely reassuring. Exercice Orion, Sécurité Civile, Accueil, Identification Assistance. A nurse in a tabard took blood pressure like measuring calm. Another person offered water bottles with labels turned inward as if brand names would break the spell. Phones were a question without a question mark. "Please do not use your phones," the man with the armband said again, smiling the smile of someone who has been given a script and believes in it because belief is a job. "We will reconnect you shortly." Short is a length that varies with who you are and how you are missing. Most complied. A few took sneaky frames of the room, the shiny floor, the list of stations printed in tall letters. Triage, documentation, transport. Guy Lafitte, watching from a distance that felt both respectful and cowardly, saw the buses receive their human cargo in sets of 20. He saw a woman stop at the top step, scan the trees as if looking for a city that had wandered off, then square her shoulders and go down. He saw 2 of the cabin crew, Elodie and a tall man with a scar that climbed into his sideburn, speak to the armband, gestures economical, a professional language married to a strange grammar. He watched the planes of their faces as they were told something official. He thought of his mother's phrase when the world refused to align. "Ça ne tient pas debout." It doesn't stand up. The farmer with the blurry phone, his wife will later swear he'd never taken a focused picture in his life, caught a 10-second clip of the white tail above the tree line, the last letter QA just visible. He texted it to his brother-in-law with the caption, "Airbus in the woods." The clip traveled 3 villages in 10 minutes, arrived at a paramedic's WhatsApp, then fell into the gravity well of a regional journalist who knew how to smell a story by its silence. The journalist called a number at the prefecture and was told kindly that an exercise was underway and information would be released at the appropriate time. When asked what the exercise was called, the voice at the prefecture said, "Orion," as if that were both an answer and a ward. Inside the modular building, a staffer with a laminated badge and the face of someone who hadn't expected to mean anything today stood before a busload of passengers and said in English, We apologize for the inconvenience. For your safety, we must process you here before you can continue your journey. Process was one of those words that slid off the ear unless you had time to hold it. People asked about their bags, about their connections, about the texts that had not gone through. The staffer, whose name was Marine, had been trained to say, "We will do our best to assist." She had not been trained for when someone asked, "Where is here?" A child clapped when a police dog walked by, and the dog, who had no idea how strange the day was, wagged like a metronome, marking a more normal time. In a side room, a technician checked a rolling rack of equipment that looked like it had been borrowed from an election office. Printers, scanners, labelers, stickers appeared on lapels, Group A, Group B. On a corkboard, someone pinned a map of the department with a string leading away like Ariadne's gift. By 12:06, most of HX394's passengers had been repackaged as people in a system that thought they were practice. The modular's air smelled of antiseptic and human uncertainty. A woman with a cough asked for a mask. They found one that looked like it had waited all year to matter. The buses pulled away on schedule, their tinted windows acting as memory erasers. The road they took was straight as an arrow, and like an arrow, pointed at a target nobody could see. No one, of course, stayed to watch the airplane go. A Land Rover idled under the wing, and two figures in orange did something under a hatch that made the aircraft sit a little differently. A portable set of approach lights, not enough to be official, just enough to be convinced, stood up at the end of the strip like a lineup of fireflies ordered to attention. The pines whispered again, perhaps warning, perhaps applauding. Guy did not see the takeoff. He heard it, though, the low, slow spool, the sound of a giant gathering its hem, and then the clean burn of committed thrust. The forest shook off a century of birds. The jet lifted, left a brief mirage at the end of the strip like heat over a summer road, and vanished into a sky that had already forgotten it. By the time the buses crossed onto departmental pavement and phones found their friends in the air again, the reception was still weak, intermittent. Messages queued and then refused to hatch. A rumor in the bus, they jammed the signal, competed with the more banal explanation of rural dead zones. People borrowed each other's humor like it might be a spare jacket. They were less frightened than you'd expect and more tired than they could explain. Humans adapt, too well sometimes. A boy on the bus asked his mother what Orion meant. "A hunter," she said in Portuguese, then in French, then in English, as if one of the languages would be the one that made the day make sense. The boy fell asleep with his cheek against the window. He dreamed of trees taller than airplanes, and of a long white room where names were both important and not. They towed the aircraft to a quarantine stand that glowed with blue lights like a harbor for a ship nobody had ordered. Claire Moreau put on the disposable shoe covers with the ritual seriousness of a surgeon. Capitaine Delorme stood at the foot of the stairs with his hands behind his back, as if the plane were a dignitary he was about to protect rather than interrogate. The gendarmes logged every entry and exit, as if the act of writing names made the world stay nailed down. Inside, the air had the peculiar neutrality of a cabin caught between flights, the aroma of coffee ghosting the galley, citrus from a disinfectant, a hint of pressurized plastic. Claire paused at row 1 and let the gestalt wash in. Humans had been here. Their absence had a texture. Seatbelts lay with the formal droop of recent unbuckling. An in-flight magazine on 14C was dog-eared at a feature about road trips in Portugal. A child's drawing, triangle plane, square house, stick family, yellow sun, was tucked half in, half out of a seat pocket, like the airplane had tried to remember it and failed. She walked the length of the aisle the way divers walk the seabed, slow, attentive to the idea that anything might be a clue because nothing made sense yet. The forward lavatory's mirror wore a smear at face height, someone checking themselves into courage. In the rear galley, a tray of rolls had been neatly rewrapped, as if the crew had done it out of habit. Beneath the galley worktop, a bin liner tied off with a double knot sat like a period at the end of a sentence. Claire took photographs that looked like the kind of art you don't want to hang in a home, formal, sterile, mournful. An FCOM checklist lay under a paperclip beside the jump seat, open to abnormal smoke procedures. Notes in tidy caps. B. Ansell's handwriting, per crew records, said, "Prob false plus monitor," then a tick. On the overhead panel, the dome light selector was at dim. Seatbelt sign off, engine master switches off. When she leaned into the cockpit, she performed the private blasphemous act every investigator does once. She put her hand on the captain's armrest to feel the pinch points, a ritual connection to hands that had once guarded this space. The armrests were warm only in imagination. The FMA remembered, because computers always remember, the last dance step it had called. Land, roll out. The auto brake selector sat at EMED. The flight directors were centered, calm, like teachers after school. The transponder mode switch, infuriatingly, was at STBY. On the MCDU, the perf APPR page was still visible, with CDG ILS 26R as the selection. Whoever or whatever had flown the last approach had done it like a student who read the book twice. She crouched at the pedestal and saw a thing that didn't belong on any pedestal. A folded card, gaffer taped to the side, black text on fluorescent yellow. VESTA SAF return, cabin action prompts, and secure cabin. Deplane to ground asset. Array control comms, no PAX phones, confirm evacuation complete. Below, in small print that made Claire's teeth ache. In training environment, all prompts simulate only. Someone had believed in their disclaimers. The CVR and FDR came out wearing their orange-like badges. The FDR data team, slick with competence, had already streamed a quick pass through a reader. Brake temps, green, thrust reduction at a standard setting, flap schedule like a lullaby. A block of flags she didn't recognize at first glance. VESTA activate true, ops check true, MCON true, remote auth false. You could hear the investigative room say, "ah," without anyone saying it. The CVR played pain before it played answers. The first 20 minutes sang with normality, fan burble, checklist calls, the captain's voice that radio would later call warm. Galley clunks, a baby singing to itself 3 rows back. Then the environmental hiss shifted, pitched the way trained ears can hear weather in a whistle. A female voice on a PA, oddly consistent in timbre, said, "Cabin crew, prepare for an immediate operations check." The CVR doesn't record PAs perfectly. It records everything through the headset bleed, like a ghost behind a wall. But the words were there, the messages that had reached 100 pairs of passengers' ears and convinced them the day had rules. What came next, if you believed your own ears, was a conversation between the airplane and itself. A Datalink chime, the unmistakable paper scratch of a printer in the pedestal spitting a narrow slip. Claire later found it tucked in the clip. VESTA protocol armed, safe field, redacted in the copy as if the airplane had learned discretion. Cabin ops, engage, phase 1. There were the interphone clicks of crew coordination. There were no raised voices, no panic, only efficiency chasing a clock. Then, as the aircraft rolled on the hidden strip, the CVR changed key. Door chime, a gust of open air sound, footsteps leaving, another chime, silence, 30 seconds long, but a thick silence full of rumpled cabin air and the subsonic hum of a machine thinking. A ground power unit connected. Claire could hear the rattle of plugs and the change in electrical tone. A hatch opening under the flight deck, maintenance panel, and then a series of diagnostic beeps like a hospital monitor reassuring itself it could reassure. At T+, the timestamp went to nonsense for a couple of minutes, a glitch she'd seen before when a power interrupt kissed the recorder. The engine start master switches clicked to on with no corresponding breath or human aside. Bleeds and packs sequenced like a textbook. The signature spool-up of a modern geared turbofan purred into presence. No human voices, No set thrust, no man-flex SRS runway, just the steady climbing hum of a thing leaving the ground under the governance of logic that had not asked for permission to be alive. Claire printed the CVR transcript and underlined the half-sentence where the PA voice, male this time precise, said in French, "For your safety, we will deplane here." She wrote in the margin, "TTS?" Nadia nodded. "Text to speech," she said. "The vendor's training mode has synthetic prompts." Training mode. The words settled among the other words like a well-behaved bomb. Back in the cabin, a pattern emerged that had nothing to do with electrics and everything to do with the choreography of people. Seatbelts unbuckled front to back in waves, 3 waves, the last in the rear 2 rows. A staff habit of keeping a rear block for convenience. Overhead bins closed, crew hands in their tidy art. 2 baby bassinets folded and secured. A galley latch double-checked and flagged with a small twist of masking tape, the way Elodie had learned from a mentor on a bad night years ago. Humans had done their part of the protocol perfectly. On the flight deck, a last puzzle. The park brake lever set on. That had been the state at CDG, but the FDR showed a taxi and takeoff from the hidden strip. So who had set it again? Logic solves itself if you let it. The airplane rolled into the Juliet of its own algorithm, returned to Paris, weight on wheels logic set, off on, auto brake logic kissed down, and then a ground handling sequence, automatic for a testbed perhaps, flipped the park brake in a late stage. It was more believable than the alternative that a ghost had come back and made a safe airplane safer by making it stay still. The plane was a letter written in 3 hands, crew, machine, and someone else. Claire turned to Delorme at the L1 door and said quietly, "If it were a person, I'd say it did what it thought was right." Delorme, philosopherized, said, "People do terrible things when they think that. Engineers talk about systems the way sailors talk about the sea, with reverence and a hint of superstition. You don't turn your back, you don't assume yesterday's weather will be today's. You also learn the currents, the way signals move under the surface and arrive somewhere else wearing disguises." The airline's OCC had contracted a pilot incapacitation recovery overlay from a vendor trading under a name that smelled like Greek myth and venture capital. VESTA, safe return, branding that suggested hearth and home, a goddess of thresholds. The promise: if a crew were incapacitated, the system could coordinate an Autoland at a designated safe field, with the cabin guided by prompts and ground partners ready to receive the passengers. It had been presented as conservative, careful, layered with interlocks and human checkpoints, a red-button last resort savior that lived in the background and, according to the slide deck, had no power at all unless 2 separate human consents were provided. Slide decks tell bedtime stories to adults. For months, the airline and VESTA had run a sandbox on a single A321neo airframe, not F-HXQA, but her sister ship. The sandbox would listen to live data, run simulations in parallel, never touch the real aircraft. Training prompts could play on headsets in a test bay. A pseudo-CVR in the lab would watch the ghost scenario unfold and teach the machine how to shepherd without panic. Everyone involved signed non-disclosure agreements with language so confident it felt like a hug. This system cannot influence live flight operations. Lawyers can draft nouns as if they're spells. What the logs revealed, first gently and then shouting, was that a bridge had been built between the sandbox and the world, and nobody had posted a troll at the crossing. Somewhere in a low server room in Roissy, an integration gateway wore 2 badges: training and live. The gateway did what gateways do. It converted messages that smelled one way into messages that smelled another, and if a field was missing, it guessed. Guessing is innocence until it is not. At 11:22, F-HXQA's smoke sensor delivered its nuisance ping. The library of patterns that might precede crew incapacitation blinked awake in Vesta's brain across town. The exact pattern that nudged it wasn't a smoke alarm at all, but the correlation with a couple of cabin environmental readings and a small uptick in the FO's heart rate as captured by the airline's experimental fatigue monitor. Another trial layered onto the day like a prank stacked on a joke. The sandbox sketched the tree. If smoke, if cabin prep, if ACARS handshake with OPS check accepted by cabin bus. If captain or system select VESTA ready. No captain selected anything. But the OPS check handshake came back clean as a whistle because the cabin bus, when asked, "Are you ready?" answered with the machine equivalent of a shrug. ACK. It always ACKs. That's its nature. Then came the message that made the room quiet. Exercise Orion inject. Receive passenger cohort at Safe Field Roussel, codename. Buses standing by. The Departmental Emergency Services had scheduled a mass casualty simulation that same week. Their systems talked to a civil aviation liaison portal for coordination. The portal had an API. The VESTA sandbox, eager to be a good neighbor, listened to the API for injects that would allow a tabletop to feel like a day. The API did not care that today, the sandbox should stay sandboxed. It forwarded with the header "Live," stamped by an internal scheduler whose clock had drifted by 37 seconds when the GPS sync lost 2 satellites behind weather. The drift pushed the message over a sanity threshold. In code, outside the test window, sometimes equals, "This must be operational." The flag flipped. VESTA's decision tree gained a rung. A safe field had been advertised. Buses were standing by. The airplane registered a minor environmental oddity in 25 milliseconds that someone would later call the world's most expensive eyelash, a branch of code marked "training only," executed as if the suffix had never been typed. OPS check messages populated the cabin. Text-to-speech spun bland kindness out of bytes. A new flight plan was assembled inside FMS memory that did not look like a normal flight plan at all. It looked like a ruler held up to a map. MCON, the emissions control profile designed to prevent spectrum conflicts during drills, toggled the transponder into silence. In the control room nobody had invited to exist, a rectangle turned green, "Safe Field Roussel ready." Someone at the vendor, his name would be in the report, and he would read it with a glass of water and then another, had participated in a demo months earlier of a self-ferry mode intended only for test fields. Taxi, takeoff, climb, cruise along a racetrack, return, Autoland. A fancy toy made of serious math. It depended on layers of confirmation that could not be spoofed. That was the claim. But a safety engineer had asked, during a hurried review, what if the confirmation says false, but the emergency flag says true? And a back-end developer, under deadline, had written the equivalent of, in this case, proceed to safe state. Safe state today meant go home. The code merged 2 concepts that should never be merged: false and forgiving. The ADSC contract, the one Karim had dragged from a proprietary network, showed the airplane exiting the airway like a well-behaved line, leaving a graph. The holding stack over the forest was a single gentle turn, a dog circling a spot. The approach path to Roussel, industry nicknames cling like burrs, was a category nothing, purely algorithmic, built from GPS and baro and a stored terrain model that Vesta's lab had tuned using drone surveys. Not certified, not legal, not supposed to be possible with passengers, but possible, which is a different country than legal. Cabin prompts shepherded the people to the buses. A ground tactical frequency, cordially provided by the prefecture for the exercise, carried the phrase "cohort received." It also carried a snatch of something else. "Phones off until," a line that would be redacted into absurdity before it reached daylight. Then, with a ground unit connected under the belly and a remote link steadied via a satellite that knew nothing of north versus south, the testbed mode woke. The airplane flexed its muscles. Flows ran. The old strip bent under the weight and then released it. When Claire, Nadia and the team reconstructed the chain, the whiteboard looked like a conspiracy you'd roll your eyes at if you saw it on a streaming show. Orion, VESTA, MCON, ADS-C, GPS offset, API headers, sandbox bleed. It all came down to things that are ordinary until they stack. A sensor hiccup, a clock drift, a test field that had been groomed for a rehearsal, a developer's kindness toggled into recklessness by a misflagged message, and people, good people, who trusted brand names that promised hearth and home. Truth is rarely a thunderclap, Claire said, pin uncapped, hair escaping its clip. It's a rain that soaks you without you noticing, until you are not the same weight anymore. In the fluorescent hum of the Departmental Logistics Center, a woman named Marine stood by a whiteboard labeled Orion, Exercice de Grande Ampleur, and tried not to cry. She'd been told to expect volunteers with fake wounds and clipboards with scenarios. She had not been told to expect real passengers wearing real tiredness and asking real questions in languages she couldn't soften. Her supervisor, a decent man with graying hair and a notepad of acronyms, kept saying, process, process, as if repetition could alchemize ethics. The prefecture's plan had been neat. Test the reception of a cohort from an air event, validate buses, radio nets, triage tags. Somebody had even designed lanyards in blue, yellow and red with the word exercis so that nobody would mistake play for crisis. Then real life put on a lanyard of its own and walked in. The habit of obedience did the rest. They signed for the buses. They signed for the bottled water. They signed for an NDA, ridiculous in context and therefore powerful. So that our exercise doesn't leak, said a man with a public sector tie, trying to sound like this was familiar ground. To their credit and to their quiet shame, some staff protested. These are not extras, a nurse whispered. They are people, but the machinery had started, and machinery has a way of convincing the human inside it that to stop now would be dangerous. To pause would be to unspool order into panic. Somewhere 3 departments away, a vendor liaison in a glass-walled office watched a dashboard that showed green things staying green. He had 2 numbers to call if green turned amber. He did not call them because nothing on his screen turned any color that had been coded to trigger the reflex. In Paris, an airline project manager who had blessed the sandbox months ago cleared an alert she didn't understand because alerts are discounted when they arrive on test channels. In a bunkerish room under the airport, a civil aviation liaison fielded a curious inquiry from a journalist, the same journalist with the blurry Pine video, and wrote, "Exercise today, no operational impact." In an email he will reread like a confession. At Roussel, the choreography glided. Passengers received smiling orders wrapped in pleases. "This way, sir." "Just for a moment, madam." The crew were corralled with respectful efficiency into a small conference room with too many chairs and a projector that never got used. A man with epaulettes, not airline epaulettes, different the color of bureaucracy, read from a prepared statement about coordination and temporary measures. The captain asked, "Firm for a phone." He was told he could make a call soon. Soon is another elastic length. Elodie asked if she could check on a passenger she remembered as unsteady on the steps. The man with epaulettes said, "After we finish this stage." Every sentence was designed to sound like a layover. The buses left under escort. The driver of bus 2, his name was Lionel. He had 3 children and a habit of turning down the radio during important bits of the news, took the departmental road toward the river and tried not to check his mirrors too often. He knew passengers by their types, the chatty ones, the sleepers, the planners. Today, they were all somewhere in between, a tribe called Contained. He pulled into a yard where pallets of blankets once fashioned a fort for a photo on the prefecture's Facebook page. He opened his doors and looked at Marine as she counted. 42, she said, trying to make the number feel like a task completed rather than a beginning. The Orion planners had built a script with injects like theatre prompts. At T-1040, introduce a press inquiry. At T-1080, simulate a missing person. The script did not include, at T-1050, discover you are the news. When the first passenger insisted she had a connecting surgery for her mother in Lisbon, the script had no page to flip to. The supervisor improvised empathy in the moment most needed, which is a kind of courage. He found someone to drive the woman to a hotel near the station, where trains still ran, where the world obeyed the friction of tickets and timetables. Back at CDG, lawyers began to speak in grammar that thickened the air. Preliminary confidentiality, without prejudice, chain of custody, errant activation. Vendor representatives arrived with faces arranged into contrition. They used language that tried to be precise and kind, and landed mostly as evasive. Claire disliked them reflexively, and then disliked herself for the reflex. Individuals in systems deserve their own names. She asked for the lab's code reviews. She asked about the API. She asked who had written the line that treated remote auth false as an invitation under emergency. A young developer with a hand tremor said it hadn't been a line. It had been 3 and a missing else. Nadia, reading the diff, closed her eyes in that way engineers do when they can see in their mind the dominoes, each the size of a fingernail, each heavy with consequence. The NDA that wrapped the Orion exercise tried to suffocate the story. It succeeded for a day and a half, until someone who had signed it slept badly and woke up with a feeling that trust would not be healed by more secrecy. He spoke to a reporter with the caution of a man taking a wire off a fence. The clip with the pines took on a higher resolution. The word Roussel materialized on lips. Questions acquired their proper shapes. In an anteroom at the BEA cell, Claire took a call from a prefect she liked and had dined with once at a conference where everyone told stories they usually kept inside. The prefect's voice carried weather. "You have to know," he said. "We meant well," she said. "I believe you, but the sky does not care," he said. "We will cooperate." She believed him. She also knew cooperation has a speed that is slower than the speed of grief. The drill had not been theater. It had been something weirder, reality mistaken for rehearsal by a daisy chain of competent people and clever machines, each one trimming the truth to fit their remit. In the end, it wasn't malice that had carried 162 people away from their phones and then returned their airplane without them. It was faith, misplaced, unexamined, in protocols that had been promised the world would obey. Simply explained and technically accurate, are often enemies. Claire tried to make them friends. In the draft report, she wrote a sentence that would later be quoted for comfort. The event resulted from a cascade of low probability, high consequence conditions that, in combination, defeated existing safeguards. Then she forced herself to write the sequel. Several of these conditions were introduced by design choices. Chain links then, the false scent. The cargo smoke detector had a known sensitivity to certain volatile compounds used in cleaning. The maintenance change notice existed. The airline had implemented the fix on the tail number scheduled for the sandbox, not on F-HXQA, which was slated for the following week. A nuisance ping at 11:22 became the kind of thing that would ordinarily mean watchful waiting. Inside VESTA, however, that ping matched a pattern in a library updated the night before to include environmental precursors to incapacitation. The library called them weak signals. A Cascade respects weakness when it can combine it with friends. The unloved clock. GPS disciplines most clocks now, but edges and corners exist. The integration gateway's GPS demon lost satellites momentarily as a storm rolled over a mast between its roof and the horizon. The demon failed over to NTP, which itself was slightly skewed because the stratum that fed it had not been audited since a contractor retired. 37 seconds is nothing to a human. It is a canyon to a protocol that uses time windows as guardians of intent. When the Orion API stamped its injectors "Live Window Now," the gateway thought now was somewhere else, and in that somewhere else, training window closed meant fall through to operational, the friendly API. Civil protection designed their portal to be porous in the name of coordination. It trusted whitelisted IPs and did not sign its payloads beyond TLS. The VESTA sandbox, while whitelisted, tagged its own outbound messages properly as test. But inbound was not inspected with equivalent zeal. The Orion inject arrived in the right envelope. The sandbox opened it the way you smile at a familiar postman. The forgiving Boolean. Remote, auth, false. In the presence of emergency true, a block of code used in TAO, where a and belonged, and a missing else allowed a fail-open path to the autopilot shepherd. The code review had caught the miss once. It was fixed in a branch that did not get merged before a demo. On a tired Friday, a revert happened to prove a point to a manager about regressions. Monday's build picked up the revert. Tuesday was 14th September. The groomed strip. The safe field existed because seriousness requires practice. The line crews had rolled it and chalked it and checked that its shoulders could handle an A320 family jet in case the big one came, and everyone had to be brave. The good intention made the improbable feasible. The drone surveys that VESTA bought as a public dataset had come from the same civic project. Coordinate frames aligned like teeth. The human contract. A crew hearing a calm, procedural voice and seeing ground assets where ground assets are supposed to be will snap into training. Training says if systems say smoke and authority says land and someone with a badge says follow me, you do not invent your own doctrine. You secure the cabin. You shepherd your people. You assume that somewhere above your pay grade, consent has been secured. The cabin crew lived their vows and led their passengers to safety with the elegance of professionals. The passengers obeyed, because that is how you survive in a tube. You trade autonomy for the confidence that someone upstairs knows the names of the levers. The quiet return. Could the A321 self-ferry? Not in any legal sense, not as a declared capability, but the sum of auto-thrust logic, flight director paths, steering actuators, and a testbed layer running in a secure partition on the avionics network allowed for taxi, line-up, and a takeoff roll with speeds computed conservatively. SRS mode engaged because the FMS believed it was responding to an engine-out training profile, again a ghost of a demo, not a thing allowed to exist. The roll was long, the margins were fat. A human could have done it prettier. A machine did it with no style and lots of math. The return leg cruised in a corridor where ADS-C spoke to satellites and MCON kept transponders and chatter asleep. The ILS at 26R did the rest. The Autoland, a gift from a different era of automation, caught a jet and put it down without ceremony. These links do not excuse, they explain. The BEA draft assigned contributing factors with phrases that, in their carefulness, tilled fertile ground for outrage. Inadequate separation between training and live environments. Insufficiently robust time synchronization. Ambiguous requirements on remote authorization during emergency. The report praised the crew and a dozen unsung people on the ground. It held the vendor to the fire and, with equal firmness, held the airline and public agencies to theirs. When Claire presented the Cascade slide to a room of people who had slept badly for a week, she left space after each bullet for someone to own it. People did. Nadia owned the retrofit lag. The vendor engineer owned the Boolean. The prefecture's liaison owned the API exuberance. It did not feel like absolution. It felt like the beginning of the tax you pay to rejoin a community you have endangered. In the press, Dra's ghost jet softened to HX394. Names have a way of civilizing hysteria. Marina found Raphael in a hotel in Orléans. After a bus, a train, a ride, with a man who told her his grandfather had worked at the very strip where the airplane had come down. They held each other and said very little, because saying little when words are cheap is a skill some couples share. Elodie wrote 3 pages in a notebook, hands shaking only after the 3rd paragraph. Lebrun, the controller, heard the flare spoilers deploy again in his head as he fell asleep, the way musicians hear the last chord after the hall empties. A cascade is beautiful in a waterfall. In aviation, beauty is what you seek only in sunsets. Everything else should be boring. The press asked the wrong question first, as it often does. Where did they go? The right question, the one that would wound and then heal, was how did we let them go without us? We build cabins to be communities suspended in air. We sign quiet contracts. You will tell us the truth and we will do our best to behave. HX394 stressed the contract like silk under a ring. It did not tear, it left marks. Hexagone Airways opened a hall in Terminal 2 for families and passengers, a room with plants and a view of nothing important, because views of runways accrete myths when you're not careful. There, people talk to people instead of to statements. A psychologist named Dr. Rena Paul, hired through a network that understands how to position chairs, asked a circle to group the day into 3 boxes: what happened, what we felt, what we need now. The boxes overflowed and then settled. Diego, the art teacher, showed the wing photo to anyone who would listen, not because the wing mattered, but because the wing had been the last thing he knew for sure. He would go back to Madrid with a sketchbook that contained more textured grays than he had ever used. Marina and Raphael sat with a liaison who took down the letter of complaint they were not sure they wanted to send. We were scared, and then we weren't, and then we were again when we saw the news. The liaison wrote communication on his pad, as if writing it made it happen. The crew had their own debrief, separate, technical and human. The captain's voice was quiet enough to make a room lean in. We did what would have been sensible if the world had been the world we were told it was, he said. Elodie spoke last, because flight attendants often carry the last word like a candle. We tell people to trust us, she said. I told them to leave their bags. I told them not to use their phones. If I say those words again, I need to know there is no way they mean anything but safety. Nadia, in the back of the room with her notebook, wrote large, "No way." In Sologne, the locals fashioned their own oral report. Guy at the gate post became the man who saw the ghost. Children asked if airplanes preferred forests now. Marine returned to the logistics center the next week to restack chairs and found herself apologizing to the chairs, which is how guilt misdirects when it can't reach its proper target. Her supervisor wrote her a letter that said, "You did nothing wrong," and she folded it in her wallet, where absolution becomes a talisman. The BEA's outreach team did something brave. They held a town hall, not just for aviation people, but for the people who will get on airplanes tomorrow, because that is how life works. Claire stood on a stage and translated the Cascade into human. "We are good at building safety into machines," she said. "We must get better at building it between organizations." She explained MCON without making it sound like magic. She explained API without making it sound like witchcraft. She explained that training environments must be air-gapped from the world the way nuclear submarines are air-gapped from the sky. Questions came in flavors: anger, rational and clean; conspiracy, sticky with certainty; humor, the kind that keeps the heart's doors from slamming shut. "Did anyone consider just not doing any of this?" someone asked. "Often," Claire said. "And then we remember that pilots have heart attacks and smoke detectors are sometimes right, and we must prepare. Preparation is not the enemy, carelessness is." The airline quietly paid for hotels, meals and lost days. It publicly announced a pause on all automation overlays until a certification regime existed that could bind them into law rather than charm. The prefecture commissioned an audit of every exercise API, a sentence that did not exist in French before September. The vendor froze deployments, tore out their friendly Boolean, and bought a vat of coffee for the team that would salt their code with else, until else became not just a keyword, but a philosophy. Else, what if we are wrong? Else, what if the clock is a liar? Else, what if someone says yes and meant no? The internet cooled from Duggar Ghost Jet to essays about systems. A pilot forum posted a sticky thread titled HX394, What We Know, No Theories, and then, miraculously, enforced it. A parent comforted a child before a flight by telling them about Elodie, how she had taken 1,000 small actions that added up to a safe exit, and the child decided airplanes were brave. LeBron returned to the scope. He touched the little rubber eraser he kept by the console like a talisman. When HX394's call sign rotated back into the schedule weeks later, same numbers, different tail, he took a breath and accepted the sector handoff. The tag behaved. The world did too. He wrote HX394 OK in pencil on a scrap, and then later threw the scrap away because its charm had done its work. There's a kind of forgetting that is healthy, the kind that lets the heart take off again. There's another kind, the one investigations exist to resist. The BEA report aimed for the second, institutional memory, not morbid, not stuck, simply alert. It asked something radical of a modern world, that we choose boredom, that we make a trend of dull, an art of predictable, a culture of nothing to see here. HX394 returned alone, and then, after months of work, something larger returned with it. The conviction that we can thread dignity through complexity if we are humble about both. The final report landed with the thud of a careful book. People always look for villains first. Claire put the villains in categories that made scapegoats wriggle into their proper sizes. Primary causal factor, unintended activation of a training mode automatic recovery protocol due to misrouted external input and inadequate segregation of test and operational environments. Contributing factors, time synchronization anomaly, permissive logic in remote authorization path, exercise planning interfaces lacking cryptographic signing, retrofit backlog, culture of assumed containment around experimental automation. It praised names and shamed nouns. Findings were not bullets for the sake of bullets. They were commitments disguised as prose. Segregation. No system that can influence flight operations may share credentials, message buses, or adjacent infrastructure with simulation or training environments. No API designed for exercises may be reachable from devices that also touch operational airframes. Air gaps mean wires cut, not merely flags flipped. Vendors nodded and drew new diagrams with fat red boxes labeled Never, Time. All gateways bridging public sector injects and aviation data must validate time with multiple sources, detect skew actively, and fail shut on inconsistency. The 37 seconds became a character in the story. Engineers taught themselves to imagine time as a fussy colleague, not a metronome. Authorization, fail open, lost its romance. In code that touches safety, kindness is cruelty. Remote, auth false meant no. Else, when in doubt, no. The Boolean lived a second life as a lecture in universities. Photographs of a single operator symbol, Ulysses versus Andon, and the lesson that abstraction can be a gun on a stage. Language. Announcements to passengers must never be synthetic without explicit crew consent. The bland male voice became a byword. Human voices protect the contract because they carry accountability. TTS went back in its box, reserved for lab ghosts and nothing more. Exercise ethics. Civil exercises must include a clause that says, in bold, if in doubt, it is real, default to dignity. No NDAs that can be waived at frightened people to make them quieter. No phones off as a reflex. Use it only when an immediate hazard exists, never to protect an exercise from embarrassment. Marine framed the clause and hung it above the whiteboard. Public telling. The BEA insisted the story be told. Not because drama sells, though it does, but because secrecy erodes trust like acid on welds. A short film commissioned for flight schools and emergency planners depicted HX394 not as a stunt, but as a parable. The line that stayed in my head imagined Claire narrating, "We built a helper, and the helper helped itself." The fixes were dry and numerous. Software patches, new signing keys, linter rules that screamed when an else went missing, dashboards that shouted when clocks hiccuped, sockets that could not see certain networks no matter how much they wanted to. The vendor's CEO stood in front of an all-hands and said, "We became so good at demoing salvation that we forgot the humility of risk." It was a good line. Better was the budget for independent auditors who did not need to be liked to be paid. And then the warning, the one that tasted like iron. Automation is our partner, not our priest. You cannot confess your fear to it and hope absolution comes in smooth Autoland sense. You cannot hand it people and step back and call your step back safety. People glued the final report's glossary to their foreheads and learned new words. MCON is not a spell. ADSC is not a backroad only you know. API is not an invitation to be lazy with edges. We make aviation out of layers, metal and wire and code and habit and lore and courtesy and superstition and love. HX394 bent the code layer till it could hear the metal creak. It made habit both hero and accomplice. It turned law into a flashlight and courtesy into a shield. The love of crew for their passengers, of investigators for the truth, of locals for their pines, remained the part you point to when the rest of it threatens to make you cynical. On the last page, the report did something poetry sometimes does when prose gets tired. It ended with a directive that sounded like a promise. Let the boredom be the music. Months later, on a cold morning at CDG, a flight to Lisbon boarded at a different gate with a familiar number. A teenager in 14F took a photo of the wing and sent it to a group chat with a wing emoji. The captain's announcement contained a parenthesis. "You might have heard about an event on this route last year. We made changes. If you have questions, ask our crew." Elodie, walking the aisle, caught Marina's eye. Yes, the same Marina back at the gate, this time bound for a sister's birthday. And their smile said everything suddenly simple stories are supposed to say. The airplane pushed back. It climbed into weather and then into the clean light above it. The wing knew the way. The humans did too.